Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Now in today's video I'm going to teach you about how to annotate your books, and we're going to apply that specifically on literature. But not only that, I'm also giving you an invite for A Classic Bookclub, this channel's official book club that you can join for free and where we're going to practice our annotation skills together. So if you like this content, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel and show your support. And by doing so, I can make more of these videos in which I can teach you how to read literature, how to analyze books, how to analyze poetry, and we're going to have so much fun doing that. Well, the first question that we need to ask ourselves is, why would we even want to annotate in the first place? The best reason to annotate is because it helps you to stay close to the story and get as much out of it as you possibly can. Because especially with literature, there are often a lot of layers in the story and you can only find out about those layers if you really dive into it. Now, there is a very important first choice that you need to make, and that is, are you going to write in your book or not? If you're not going to write in your book, then you have to find some other system to keep track of your notes. Maybe a certain notebook would help. Maybe you can make notes on your computer. Well, at first, when I was making this decision for myself, I thought, okay, I cannot write in my book.
Writing in books is a sin. It's a profanity. You cannot do that.
But then I was like,
yeah, well, but if I write in my books, I will learn more from them. I will gain more from them. So shouldn't I just be able to write in my books?
I made that decision. I am now writing in my books. So when you're starting your annotation journey, it is important to get an idea of what you want to get out of that book. So I see a lot of YouTube videos where people explain how they annotate, and what they do is they will get beautiful quotes from the book and just mark down everything they find interesting and that appeals to them. And of course that's totally fine, and it really helps you create an idea of why you do or don't like a certain book. But what we are going to do in this video is we're going to look at the literary elements, because these will help you understand the story much better, and that makes the book more interesting. You will get more out of it, and I think it makes your reading just a lot more fun. Now, and to do so, we're going to focus on 6 literary elements: plot, narration, characters, style, setting, and theme. Now, I could make a separate video about each of these elements, and if you want me to do that, please leave a comment down below, because for each of these elements there is such a vast amount of information that we can discuss. But today I want to focus on the basics only. So what is important to note beforehand is that by annotating these 6 elements in your book, you don't automatically and magically gain understanding of that text. I wish that was true. But in reality, you will need to ask yourself deeper questions to see the connections between the things you marked up and what the deeper meaning of that text is. So for example, last week I read this short story that took place at this dead-end street. Now, in and of itself, that might not be meaningful, but once you actively ask yourself questions about, hey, why am I reading this? And hey, I'm also reading about a character that wants to escape his current social status, then these two together make much more sense, and you see how the imagery is used to strengthen the current story. So the first element that you'll need to pay attention to is the plot. And that doesn't just mean looking at what happens in the story, but try to determine what kind of conflicts arise. And there are 2 types of conflicts. Internal conflicts, so a struggle within yourself. So maybe you are conflicted because on the one hand you want to do something for some reason, but on the other hand you want to do something else. That's an internal conflict. You can also have external conflicts, for example, when the hero is battling with the villain. So make sure that each time you spot a conflict, you make a short annotation of that. Another thing that's very helpful when you're looking for plot elements is to describe the story arc, which is exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. In the exposition, you're being introduced to all the characters. Then in the rising action, you start to have that story build up that results in the ultimate climax. That's when the emotional relief is at its highest point. So in the falling action, you will see what happens after that emotional high point, and it works towards the resolution where it's all being solved. Now there's much more to say about that story arc. So again, if you want me to do a detailed video about any of these topics that we've covered today, please feel free to leave a comment down below because there's so much more we can discuss. A second thing to look out for is the narration. So who is telling the story? Now oftentimes that is a third person narrator who is not part of the story and who is telling the story to you. And it gives you insight into especially one character's point of view. Or is there a first person narrator who is part of that story? And in that last case, is there a reason for you to maybe not take that narrator too seriously? Because maybe he or she has value by portraying the events in a certain way. So see if you can find some relevant pieces of the story that help you answer who is this narrator and why is that important. So in case of a third author perspective, things that you could focus on are what parts of the story are being highlighted and which are kind of skimmed over and what would be the relevance of that. And if it's a first person narrator, as I mentioned, is that narrator maybe hiding some of the facts and why would he or she do that? So the next thing you'll need to annotate for is the characters. And I think that's one of the simplest ones. So you write down or you annotate their names, their physical build, their main motives, the main reason why they're doing certain things, and also how characters do or do not like each other. Now please pay attention also to the name of the character because oftentimes that tells you a lot. So for example, did you know that Ron Weasley is called Ron Weasley? Because we usually associate short names with people from a lower social milieu, but also Weasley really is apparently a working class name. So that builds into his character of a large family that has not a lot of money. And of course, I'm talking about Ron Weasley of Harry Potter. So another thing to look for is the setting, and that means the general setting, so the year in which it takes place, but also the historical context in which it takes place or the future context in which it takes place, and also cultural elements that are relevant to that particular time. Also have to look at the particular setting, meaning what happens within every chapter and where that is located. So for example, maybe certain scenes are set at a very wild nature that could be very important to your story, whereas other chapters are located in a specific type of room with a specific type of layout, and that could also be highly relevant to your story. So another thing to mark in your stories is the use of style. And with that I mean, for example, the use of images, the figurative language, but it can also mean certain word use. So maybe someone is using words that make kind of a buzzing sound, like we're in a beehive or something. And if bees are a very important symbol in your story, that could be an important thing to look out for. So there's a lot of terminology involved when we're talking about figure of speech. We have metaphors, we have symbols, we have similes. We're not going to dive into all of that just today. But what is important in general is that you note information that seems to represent something more than just the word itself. When I, for example, look back at the book 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the color yellow seems to have an important role. There are yellow flowers coming from the sky. Then at one point you realize, hey, I need to pay attention. This color yellow is important. And then at the end of our read, we will make sense about exactly why that was the case. You can also look at patterns of words that are occurring throughout the story. Now, the last element that we need to annotate for is the theme. And to be honest, that is, I think, the most complicated one out of the 6. Basically, think about the theme as what is the main message that this author wants to convey. And it shouldn't be about the specific book and the specific characters, but the lesson that that book is teaching us that transcends the story of that book. That's a universal thing we can learn from that book. An important question to ask yourself when you want to find that theme is, what does this story reveal? Now, and to get an idea for that, pay close attention to the title of the book, but if there are chapter titles, those could be really helpful as well. So for example, in the book 100 Years of Solitude, the word solitude is not only used in the title, but also at several places in the book. So having an idea of that repetition will also help you identify the theme of the story. So by now your brain is probably completely fried from all the things that I've mentioned that are good to look out for when you're annotating a story. So how are you all going to do that within one read? Well, you're not. Actually, you have to read the book at least twice. And maybe even more times if you really need to dive into the content. So what that means is we're going to split up our annotations into 2 different rounds. I'm sorry, but trust me, you will get something out of that process. The most important goal of your first round of reading is to get familiar with the story, be part of that story, and to annotate the things that will hinder your flow of reading least. So what I would recommend of annotating in your first read is first, write down your own thoughts. Whenever something is particularly funny for you or scary or it reminds you of something, make a mark and write something down in the margin. That is your reader response to the story. Second of all, annotate the easiest elements of that story. And I think that is, for example, the setting. So make sure that after reading each chapter, you go back and make an annotation of where this story was located in that specific chapter. Second, every time a new character is being introduced to you, make sure to at least highlight that person's name, maybe the physique if that is being described, and maybe some other really important information, because the most important information about a character is often introduced to us immediately once we get to know that character. And another thing you could try to spot as much as you can in that first read are the conflicts that are happening, either internal, so within the character, or external, meaning the character versus something else. So I think when you note these things down in your first read, you will already have made some very helpful annotations that do not hinder your reading flow that much. And then we're ready for our second read. And I know you're probably thinking, that girl is crazy. I'm not going to read that book again. And of course, if you're reading War and Peace, for example, I completely understand where you're coming from. But if you're learning to annotate, this process of rereading is so helpful to get familiarized to all the things that you can pay attention to and to highlight all the connections that there also are. Because these elements, as I said in the beginning, they do not stand for themselves. They are also important in relation to each other. So for example, the setting can be related to the character. It can mirror the nature of that character, for example. And basically what you will do in your second read is pay attention to all of these elements. So again, try to focus on the narrative, the plot, the setting, all those things. And what I would recommend is to make a little cheat sheet for yourself so that you keep track of what it is that you need to find out. So another thing to take into account that might be very useful is if you start using color codes for your entire story, so that you will make connections also based on the color that you're using. So for example, I am using a blue pen if I'm talking about my own response to the story, because it sets out, it's a different type of color than the font. And I'm using my black pen whenever I want to note something and I want to explain my ideas related to that story. But I also have a system for my highlighters. So for example, I am using an orange marker to write down things about the character. So I mark when a character is being introduced, his name, his physique, those kinds of things. And I use a pink highlighter, for example, for the setting and all the details that are given about that. So for example, the landscape, the layout of a room, the time period, maybe even the weather. And I would advise you to pick a different color for each of the elements that we talked about today, just to make sure that you can easily spot which annotation refers to which literary element. So today we learned a lot about annotating our stories. But of course, that knowledge will only stick to our brains if we actively practice with it. And for that, I want to invite you to A Classic Bookclub, my official book club. And it's an online system. We talk together via Discord and we share our insights. And I think it would be so much fun if we learn together about how to annotate, how to analyze these stories. And each and everyone's perspective is valued here. So it doesn't matter if you have a lot of experience or if you're just a newbie like myself. Let's just learn together from this content. And we're going to study together Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And I picked that book for a number of reasons. So first of all, this is a thin book. And I think that's hugely important when you're starting out to read classics. It's not a big slog to get through. It also is a children's story. So I think it is a suitable level for everyone to get more familiar to annotating, how to read literature. The book is also very cheap. You can get it for a couple of euros down from Amazon or the Book Depository. And I think that's also an important selling point for this book. I don't want to be too exclusive by using too expensive books or materials. Now, we're not going to start reading just yet. I want to invite you and give you the opportunity to first buy that book for yourself, make sure that it gets transported to your house, and then in 1 week we're going to start reading. Now, I already mentioned my Discord server, and once you will log into that Discord, you will also see a timeline that I am proposing. So when will you have to read specific passages? And also I will link all the information about annotating there so that you will have this kind of cheat sheet that can guide you along your reading process. So I will film a couple of videos related to this book, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. I will film one where I will explain more about what that story actually is, but of course I will also make one where I discuss the book in the end. So you don't have to follow the Discord server, but I think joining A Classic Book Club will be a very fun addition. So I hope you will join us there. So I'll be back on May 5th, where I will properly introduce our book Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and I will explain all about our reading schedule, how we're going to tackle this. I will make a short recap of our annotation strategies, and then we will really focus on diving into that classic. If you like this content, please support this channel by giving it a like and subscribing to it, and then I hope to see you in a week where we will start our joint read of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. I can't wait. See you next week. Bye.